For 5 years, I was the invisible thread holding my family's beautiful life together, quietly washing their dishes, watching their children, and absorbing their casual cruelty. They looked at my faded cardigans and assumed I was a burden, a penniless widow living on their charity. They had no idea that the very roof over their heads belonged to me, or that I held the power to dismantle their lives with a single signature. I chose silence not out of weakness, but because I wanted to see exactly how far they would go before they broke me. If you are ready to witness how a mother's silent endurance turns into a quiet, devastating reckoning, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened. When the people you love the most treat you like a shadow, what happens when you finally decide to step into the light? The grease on Julian's roasting pan never quite came off with the first wash. It required hot water, coarse salt, and a physical effort that made the joints in my fingers throb long after the kitchen had gone dark. I didn't mind the work itself. I minded the quiet, deliberate way my daughter-in-law Claire would inspect the glass baking dishes when she thought I wasn't looking. She would hold them up to the recessed LED lights of her pristine kitchen, squinting at the corners, before placing them back in the cabinet with a soft, disappointed sigh that carried more weight than any spoken reprimand. "We have to be careful with the septic system, Eleanor," Claire said, her voice carrying that light, musical cadence she used when she wanted to soften a blow. She didn't look up from her iPad, where she was curating a digital mood board for her upcoming autumn charity luncheon. "The grease. I've told you twice this week. If the pipes clog again, Julian will have to call the plumber, and things are, well, you know how stressful his quarterly targets are right now." "I used the hot water, Claire." "And the blue soap," I said quietly, keeping my back to her. My voice sounded thin to my own ears, worn down by years of speaking only when spoken to. "I know you try, dear," she murmured, her stylus tapping rhythmically against the screen. Tap, tap, tap. "It's just that, at your age, details get missed. It's completely natural. We just have to adjust." I wiped my hands on the faded kitchen towel I had brought with me from my old house, the one with the small, frayed bluebells embroidered in the corner. It was a relic of a life they had systematically disassembled 5 years ago, right after my husband Richard passed away. They had told me my modest 3-bedroom bungalow was too much for an elderly woman to maintain. They had sold it, managed the transition, and generously offered me the finished basement suite in their suburban colonial. They thought they were doing me a favor. They thought they were harboring a destitute widow whose only asset was a meager monthly Social Security check that barely covered her own medication. The heavy front door clicked open, and the cold autumn wind swept into the foyer, followed by the heavy step of my son, Julian. He was 34, with the sharp, defensive posture of a man who spent his days pretending to be wealthier and more successful than he actually was. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the hardwood floor with a dull thud. "Mom," he muttered, acknowledging me with a brief nod as he loosened his tie. He didn't offer a hug. He rarely did anymore. "Is dinner ready? I have a Zoom call with the regional director in 40 minutes. "It's in the warming drawer, Julian," I said, offering him a small, tired smile. "Beef stew, the way your father liked it." Julian winced slightly at the mention of his father, a habit he had developed over the last few years. "Right, thanks." He turned his attention immediately to Claire, leaning over her shoulder to kiss her cheek. "Did the landscapers come? The lawn looks uneven near the driveway." "They came, but they raised their rates again," Claire said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was entirely audible from where I stood by the sink. "I told them we'd have to think about it. Honestly, Julian, with the country club dues increasing next month, we might have to cut back somewhere. I was thinking, maybe we don't need the weekly cleaning service anymore. If your mother is here during the day anyway." She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Julian didn't object. He didn't even hesitate. He simply glanced toward the kitchen sink, where my hands were still damp, and gave a slow, pragmatic nod. "We can talk about it tonight," he said. "It makes sense. She's got the time." I stood there, the damp bluebell towel clutched in my fist, watching the two of them discuss my labor as if I were a piece of secondhand furniture they were trying to find a use for. They didn't ask if my arthritis was flaring up. They didn't ask if I minded spending my Tuesdays scrubbing their toilets in addition to doing their laundry, cooking their meals, and watching their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. I said nothing. I reached into my cardigan pocket and felt the cool, hard edge of the small brass key I kept hidden there. An hour later, after I had served their dinner and cleaned the table, I retreated down the carpeted stairs to the basement. It was always colder down here. The air carried a faint, musty scent of damp concrete, despite the expensive dehumidifier Julian had installed and billed me for. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, the grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner of the small living area. It was one of the few pieces of furniture I had insisted on keeping from my old home. Its steady, rhythmic tick-tock was the only sound that comforted me in the dark. I reached under the bed and pulled out my old wooden sewing basket. Beneath the tangled skeins of yarn, the rusted safety pins, and the yellowed lace trim lay a small, black, leather-bound ledger. I opened it. The numbers on the pages were written in my late husband's neat, architectural script, followed by my own precise annotations. Finch Land Holdings, LLC. Current valuation, $22,400,000. Liquid reserves, $4,850,000. I stared at the figures, the ink dark and absolute against the cream paper. 5 years ago, before Richard died, he had looked at me from his hospital bed and whispered, "Don't tell them, Eleanor. Not yet. Let them build their own lives first. See who they choose to become when they think they have nothing to inherit. Only then will you know if they are ready for the weight of it." I had promised him. And for 5 years, I had kept that promise, watching my only son slowly turn his back on me, treating me like a charity case while he struggled to pay the mortgage on a house I could have bought 10 times over with pocket change. From upstairs, I heard the muffled sound of Julian's voice rising in anger. A door slammed. Then, the quiet, unmistakable sound of Claire crying. I closed the ledger, locked the sewing basket, and slid it back under the bed. The silence of the basement pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I knew what was coming. I had seen the past due notices hidden under the junk mail on the kitchen counter. I knew Julian's firm was downsizing. They were drowning, and they were about to look to me, not for help, but for a sacrifice. The morning light in the Finch household never reached the basement stairs. By 6, I was already in the kitchen, packing Lily's lunchbox. I sliced the apples thin, just the way she liked them, and cut the crusts off her turkey sandwich. Lily, at 6 years old, was already learning the language of conditional love. She sat at the kitchen island, swinging her legs, her eyes glued to her tablet. "Grandma," she said, without looking up, "why do you always wear that gray sweater? Mommy says it has pills on it. She said it makes us look like we can't afford nice things." My hand paused over the lunchbox. The gray sweater was cashmere, a gift from Richard for our 30th anniversary. It was worn at the cuffs, yes, but it was warm and it smelled faintly of the cedar chest where I kept my memories. "I like this sweater, Lily," I said softly, sealing the plastic container. "It keeps me warm." "Mommy says we're going to buy you a new one for Christmas. Lily continued, her small voice entirely devoid of malice, merely repeating the dinner table gossip she had absorbed. But only if Julian gets his bonus. She said we have to budget because your medicines cost so much. I didn't correct her. My medications were paid for entirely by my own Medicare and a supplemental policy they knew nothing about. Whatever Julian paid for was a fiction he created to make himself feel like a martyr. I simply patted Lily's head and placed the lunchbox in her backpack. At 8, the kitchen filled with the familiar, frantic energy of a family running on borrowed time. Claire was on her phone, muttering about a delayed shipment of organic linen napkins for her luncheon, while Julian stood by the island, staring blankly into his coffee mug. The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive chime that made Julian flinch. "Who on earth is that at this hour?" Claire hissed, gesturing for me to answer it. I opened the door to find my daughter, Beatrice. At 28, Beatrice lived in a downtown loft she couldn't afford, working a public relations job that paid in prestige rather than currency. She carried a massive designer tote bag and a pile of dry cleaning draped over her arm. She swept past me without a greeting, leaving the scent of expensive, heavy perfume in the drafty entryway. "Julian, I need a massive favor," Beatrice said, throwing her dry cleaning over the back of the sofa. A custom velvet piece Claire treated like an altar. "My landlord is being an absolute tyrant about the parking space, and my car is making this horrible grinding noise." "I can't help you with money, Bea," Julian said, his voice flat. He didn't look up from his coffee. "We're stretched thin as it is." "I'm not asking for money," Beatrice lied, her lower lip trembling slightly. She had always used tears as currency. "I just need to borrow Claire's SUV for the afternoon. And, Mom—" She finally turned her gaze to me, her eyes sweeping over my apron. "Could you take this dry cleaning down to the basement? The silk blouse has a red wine stain on the collar. The cleaner said it's ruined, but you're so good with club soda and vinegar." "I have a lot of laundry to do today, Beatrice," I said quietly. "Oh, come on, Mom. It'll take you 5 minutes," she said, already reaching into her bag for her car keys. "You're here all day anyway. What else are you going to do?" Claire intervened, her voice sweet but firm. "Beatrice, I need my car for the country club committee meeting at noon, but your mother can definitely look at the blouse. Eleanor, put it in the sink with some cold water before the stain sets permanently." I looked at the silk blouse. It was a $300 garment, ruined by carelessness. Beatrice had bought it on a credit card she would eventually ask Julian to help pay off. I took the hanger from her hand. The fabric felt cold and slippery against my calloused fingers. "Thank you, Mom," Beatrice said, already turning back to Julian to argue about the car. "By the way, Claire, did you book the photographer for the family portraits on Sunday?" Claire's expression shifted, a sudden, subtle tension tightening the corners of her mouth. She glanced at me, then back at Beatrice. "Yes," Claire said, her voice dropping a fraction. "I booked the autumn session at the Botanical Gardens, just the 3 of us and Lily. We're doing the cream and beige aesthetic. It's very cohesive." The kitchen fell into a sudden, awkward silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder, filling the space between us. Just the 3 of us and Lily. Beatrice looked at me, a brief flash of discomfort crossing her face before she shrugged it off. "Oh, right. Well, that'll look beautiful on the holiday cards." "Eleanor," Claire said quickly, her tone overly bright, "we'll need you to watch Lily while we're at the gardens. The photographer said children get so distracted when there are too many adults around. It'll be much easier if you keep her here and have her dinner ready when we get back." "I see," I said. I looked at my son. Julian was staring down at his polished leather shoes, refusing to meet my eye. He knew what this was. He knew his wife was erasing me from the family archive, one photograph at a time, and he was letting her do it to keep the peace. "That's fine," I said, my voice steady, carrying no trace of the quiet ache in my chest. "I'll stay with Lily." Later that afternoon, while the house was empty and the silence returned, I sat in my basement room. I had soaked Beatrice's silk blouse, meticulously removing the stain until the fabric was spotless. I set my chipped blue willow teacup down on the small nightstand. The porcelain was warm. My old flip phone, a model I kept because it was reliable and untraceable by Julian's family plan, vibrated on the mattress. The screen showed an unrecognized number from a local area code. I answered it on the third ring. "Hello?" "Mrs. Finch?" a man's voice asked, professional and crisp. "My name is David Vance. I'm the lead counsel for Vanguard Development. We've been trying to reach the principal of Finch Land Holdings regarding the commercial parcel on Route 9. We've submitted 3 offers to your trust, but we haven't received a response." I knew the parcel. It was a 20-acre tract of prime commercial real estate that Julian's corporate employer had been desperately trying to acquire for their new regional headquarters. If Julian's firm didn't secure that land, his department would likely be eliminated. "I received your offers, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice calm, devoid of the exhaustion I wore like a second skin upstairs. "Are you open to negotiation, Mrs. Finch? My clients are prepared to go well above market value. It would be a life-changing sum." I looked at the locked sewing basket under my bed. I looked at the ceiling, where I could hear the faint, distant hum of Julian's empty house. "No," I said softly. "Not yet." The steam from the iron hissed as I pressed it against Julian's linen trousers. It was Sunday morning, and the house smelled of espresso and Claire's expensive hairspray. Downstairs in the basement, I had spent the last hour meticulously ironing 3 sets of cream and beige outfits, ensuring there wasn't a single wrinkle in the fabric before they left for their family portraits. "Is the linen ready, Eleanor?" Claire's voice drifted down the stairs, sharp with the anxiety of someone whose self-worth depended entirely on the perfection of a photograph. "Almost finished, Claire," I called back, my voice steady despite the ache in my lower back from leaning over the board. I carried the garments upstairs, holding them high so they wouldn't touch the carpet. Julian was standing in the hallway, looking at his reflection in the gilded mirror Claire had bought at an estate sale. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, but his beige sweater was immaculate. "Thanks, Mom," he said, taking his trousers from me. He didn't look at my face. His attention was already drifting to his phone, which was vibrating in his hand. Claire swept into the room, a vision of polished suburban elegance in a cream silk dress. She took Lily's tiny beige cardigan from my hand with a brief, tight smile. "Perfect. Lily, come here and let Mommy put your sweater on." Lily ran into the room, already dressed in her matching skirt. She looked like a miniature version of her mother, curated and fragile. As Claire adjusted her collar, Julian walked out toward the garage, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was hushed, but the tension in his posture was obvious. "We're leaving in 10 minutes, Claire said, not looking at me as she patted Lily's hair into place. "Eleanor, while we're gone, could you run a cloth over the baseboards in the living room? Dust always shows up so clearly in the afternoon light. And please make sure Lily's dinner is ready by 5. We'll probably go out for a glass of wine after the session to celebrate getting through it." "Of course," I said. I stood by the window as they walked down the driveway to their gleaming SUV. It was a beautiful autumn afternoon, the leaves painted in brilliant shades of amber and gold. The sun was warm, but inside the house, the air felt cold and stagnant. They looked like a picture-perfect family from a magazine as they piled into the car. Not once did any of them look back at the window where I stood. When the sound of their engine faded down the street, the silence of the large house settled over me. I went to the living room and knelt on the hardwood floor with a damp microfiber cloth. As I wiped the white baseboards, my gaze fell on the heavy oak mantel above the fireplace. It was covered in framed photographs. There was Julian and Claire's wedding in Tuscany, Julian's graduation from his MBA program, Lily as a baby. There was not a single photograph of Richard. There was not a single photograph of me. It was as if I had never existed before the moment I became their live-in housekeeper. I sat back on my heels, my knees aching against the hard floor. The psychological erasure was complete. They hadn't just taken my home and my independence. They had rewritten history to ensure their own narrative remained untroubled by the reality of my sacrifice. To pass the time, I went downstairs to my small room to tidy up. While dusting the top of my dresser, I accidentally nudged a small, tarnished silver frame. It slid behind the mirror, and when I reached down to retrieve it, my fingers brushed against an old manila envelope I had forgotten was there. I pulled it out. Inside was a single photograph from 30 years ago. Richard and I were standing on the deck of our first sailing yacht, the Eleanor II. I was wearing a simple navy dress, my hair windswept, laughing as Richard held me close. We looked radiant, wealthy, and deeply in love. In the background, the skyline of the city's private marina rose against the blue sky. "Grandma?" I jumped slightly, quickly sliding the photograph back into the envelope. I hadn't heard the garage door open or the front door click. It was only 3 p.m. Julian walked into the basement guest room. He looked pale, his beige sweater slightly damp from a sudden drizzle that had started outside. "Julian?" I asked, rising slowly. "Why are you back so early? Where are Claire and Lily?" "The photographer's assistant had an emergency. They had to cut the session short," he said, his voice unusually quiet, almost hollow. He sat down heavily on the edge of my narrow bed, putting his head in his hands. He looked incredibly small in the dim basement light. "Are you all right, son?" I asked, stepping closer, the maternal instinct I had tried so hard to suppress instantly rising to the surface. He didn't answer for a long time. The grandfather clock upstairs ticked, the sound echoing down the stairwell. "They're going to lay off my entire division, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The regional headquarters project is dead. The landowners on Route 9 refuse to sell. My boss said if we don't secure that parcel by the end of the month, the firm is pulling out of the state. I'll lose everything. The house, the car, the club. Claire," he looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, childlike terror. He had no idea that the tyrant holding the land, the anonymous owner of Finch Land Holdings, who was about to sink his entire world, was sitting right in front of him on a faded basement chair. "I don't know what to do," he sobbed quietly. "I have no one else to turn to." I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the first time I had touched him in months. But as I looked at his expensive, tear-stained beige sweater, I realized he wasn't crying because he loved me or because he needed his mother. He was crying because he had run out of people to use. "It will be all right, Julian," I said softly, my voice devoid of emotion as the cold truth settled into my bones. "Everything will find its proper place." By the next morning, Julian's moment of vulnerability had vanished as quickly as the autumn rain. He stood in the kitchen at 7, his suit jacket already on, his posture stiff and defensive. When I offered him a cup of coffee, he took it without looking at me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. They were cold. "Don't say anything to Claire about yesterday, Mom," he said. His voice dropped to a low, warning register. I was stressed. I overreacted. Things at the firm are under control. "Of course, Julian," I said, setting the sugar bowl on the counter. "Your secret is safe with me." He glanced at me then, a quick, suspicious flick of his eyes, as if searching for sarcasm in my face. But I kept my expression perfectly smooth, the blank canvas they had grown accustomed to. He nodded, satisfied with my compliance, and walked out to the garage. An hour later, Claire came down the stairs, her face tight with a different kind of anger. She was carrying a stack of beige linen tablecloths from the dining room. "Eleanor, did you use bleach on these?" she demanded, throwing them onto the kitchen island. "There's a faint yellow spot on the edge of this one. It's completely ruined." I looked at the spot, which was no larger than a dime. "No bleach, Claire. It's just the natural aging of the linen. It's 30 years old. My mother gave them to me." "Well, they look cheap," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "And we have the Prestons coming over for dinner on Thursday. Julian's boss is practically the gatekeeper for his promotion, and I cannot have a dingy table. We'll have to buy new ones." "I swear, Eleanor, sometimes I think you do these things on purpose, just to make my life harder." She didn't wait for a reply. She swept out of the room to check on Lily, leaving me with the stack of linens my own mother had hand-embroidered for my wedding. I picked up the fabric, tracing the delicate, tiny stitches with my thumb. The pain didn't sting anymore. It was a dull, familiar ache, like an old injury before a storm. I realized then that neglect isn't always loud. It's the gradual stripping away of a person's history, piece by piece, until they are nothing but a ghost in their own home. By Thursday afternoon, the preparations for the dinner party were in full swing. Claire had spent the morning pacing the house, barked orders at the florist over the phone, and rearranging the furniture. At 3 o'clock, she came into the kitchen where I was prepping the roasted asparagus. "Eleanor," she said, her tone dripping with that manipulative sweetness she used when she was about to ask for something degrading. "I was thinking about tonight. The Prestons are very traditional. They're from that old money circle in the hills." "I see," I said, continuing to snap the woody ends off the asparagus spears. "Yes, and with Julian's situation at the office being so delicate right now, we really need the evening to be flawless. We want to show them how modern and streamlined our life is." She paused, smoothing down her designer skirt. "So, I think it would be best if you stayed downstairs tonight. We'll have the caterer's assistant serve, and it might look a bit cluttered if you're hovering around the kitchen. We want the house to feel spacious." "Cluttered," I repeated softly. "You know what I mean, dear," she said, patting my arm with a hand that felt like dry ice. "It's a long evening, and your knees have been bothering you anyway. It's really for your own comfort. I'll bring a plate down to you after they're served." "That's very thoughtful of you, Claire," I said, my voice empty of the sarcasm that wanted to slip through. "I'll stay in the basement." "Thank you, Eleanor. You're such a help." I spent the evening in my cold room, the sound of laughter and clinking wine glasses drifting down through the floorboards above my head. The grandfather clock ticked its steady, indifferent rhythm. I sat in my armchair, drinking chamomile tea from my chipped blue willow cup, watching the dust motes dance in the light of the single floor lamp. At 9, the basement door opened, and Beatrice stepped down the stairs. She wasn't carrying a plate of food. Instead, she had a glass of white wine in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked around my small space with a critical, appraising eye. "Hey, Mom," she said, leaning against my dresser. "Claire said you were resting." "I am," I said. "Good, because we were talking upstairs. Well, Claire and I were, while Julian was talking to Mr. Preston." Beatrice took a sip of her wine, her eyes darting to the small window near the ceiling. You know, this basement has its own walkout door to the patio, and the market is so crazy right now. I sat quietly, waiting for the blow. We were thinking, Beatrice continued, her tone casual, as if she were discussing the weather. Julian's mortgage is astronomical, and with his bonus being up in the air, if we moved you into that lovely new senior development over on Elm Street, the one with the community gardens, Julian could easily rent this basement out to a medical student from the university. It would cover almost half their monthly payment. She looked at me, expecting me to argue, to cry, to plead, but I only stared at her, my heart hardening into a cold, diamond-hard stone. It's just an idea, Beatrice said quickly, sensing the absolute stillness in the room. We just want what's best for everyone. You'd have friends your own age there, Mom. You wouldn't have to do so much housework. I see, I said, my voice barely a whisper. And what does Julian think of this? Oh, he agreed it was a smart financial move, Beatrice said, waving her hand dismissively. He's just too stressed to bring it up to you himself. Before I could answer, the front door upstairs opened and closed with a heavy slam, followed by the sound of Julian's raised voice. What do you mean it was delivered here? He was shouting. Beatrice frowned, setting her wineglass down on my dresser. What is he yelling about? I rose slowly from my chair. Let's go find out. When we reached the top of the stairs, Julian was standing in the foyer, holding a thick, white overnight envelope. His face was entirely bloodless, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. Claire stood beside him, her hand pressed over her mouth. Julian? Beatrice asked, stepping into the hallway. What's going on? Julian slowly turned the envelope toward us. It was a certified letter from the senior partner of Vance and Associates, the law firm that managed my estate. Across the front, in bold, black lettering, it was addressed to Eleanor Vance Finch, sole trustee, Finch Land Holdings, LLC. Julian looked at the envelope, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. The silence in the hallway was so absolute that I could hear the faint, distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Mom, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. Who is Eleanor Vance? Julian stood frozen, the envelope trembling in his hand like a dry leaf. His mouth was slightly open, his breathing shallow. Beside him, Claire looked as though she had been struck. Her eyes darted from the legal document to the envelope, and finally to me, her mind visibly spinning as she tried to calculate the mathematics of the situation. Mom, Julian repeated, his voice barely a squeak this time. What is this? Finch Land Holdings? That's the trust that owns the Route 9 parcel. The lawyer, they said the trustee was an E.V. Finch. We all thought, it was some distant cousin of Dad's in Chicago. Vance was my maiden name, Julian, I said, my voice low and perfectly even. I reached out and calmly took the overnight envelope from his fingers. The cardboard was stiff, the weight of the legal documents inside substantial. Your father and I established the holding company 30 years ago, before you were born. Beatrice took a step forward, her phone dangling forgotten from her hand. Wait, if you own the land, then you have money? Real money? Her eyes widened as she looked at my faded gray cardigan, then around the elegant foyer, as if seeing everything in a completely different light. Mom, why are you living in our basement if you're rich? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. I am living in your basement, Beatrice, Because you and Julian insisted I sell my home, I said quietly. And because I wanted to be close to my grandchildren. But the trust, Julian stammered, his face flushing a deep, angry red. The fear in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by the indignant rage of an entitled child who felt he had been cheated. You let us struggle. You watched me sweat over the mortgage every single month. You listened to Claire worry about the country club dues, and you let Beatrice worry about her rent. You sat there washing our dishes while you were sitting on a fortune? Julian, please, don't raise your voice at your mother, Claire interrupted quickly. Her tone had undergone a terrifying, instantaneous transformation. The sharp, dismissive edge she had used with me for years was entirely gone, replaced by a syrupy, desperate sweetness that made my stomach turn. She stepped closer to me, her hand reaching out as if to touch my arm, though she hesitated at the last second. Eleanor, sweetie, Julian is just stressed. We're all just shocked. We had no idea. I know you didn't, Claire, I said, looking her directly in the eyes. She flinched slightly under my gaze, her fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She knew exactly what she had done over the last 5 years. She remembered the yellowed linen tablecloths, the cold basement room, the instructions to stay out of sight during the dinner party. I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized she had been treating a multi-millionaire like an unpaid servant. Why? Julian demanded, taking a step toward me. Why would you do this to us? Why keep it a secret? Your father asked me to, I said. Before he died, Richard looked at the way the two of you were living, spending money you hadn't earned, treating people as if they were beneath you. He wanted to see what kind of people you would become if you thought you had nothing to inherit. He wanted to know if you would still love me when I had nothing left to give you but my time. The silence that followed was suffocating. Beatrice looked down at her designer shoes, her face burning with a sudden, rare flush of shame. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The truth of his father's words was a mirror he couldn't bear to look into. For 5 years, they had failed the test every single day. They had treated my presence as a burden, my labor as their birthright, and my feelings as entirely irrelevant. Eleanor, Claire whispered, her voice trembling, we love you. You know we do. We've always wanted you here with us. The basement, we only put you down there so you would have your own privacy. We thought you wanted your own space. It was a pathetic lie, and we all knew it. I'm going downstairs now, I said, not bothering to address the falsehood. I have some papers to read. Mom, wait, Julian said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading tone. He took a step toward the basement stairs. The Route 9 land, my firm, we need that parcel. If we don't get it, my division is gone. I'll be laid off, please, Mom. You have to sell it to us. You can name your price. I can introduce you to the regional director tomorrow. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back at my son. He was 34 years old, but in that moment, he looked exactly like he did when he was 8, begging for a toy he hadn't earned. I'll think about it, Julian, I said softly. I walked down the stairs, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. In the quiet of my room, I sat in my armchair and turned on the single lamp. I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal, binding offer from Vanguard Development, Julian's employer's biggest rival, to purchase the Route 9 parcel for $3 million above the market average. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I picked up my chipped blue willow teacup, the porcelain cool against my lips, and stared at the contract. The power had shifted completely, but as I sat alone in the damp basement, I felt no joy, no triumph, only a profound, cold emptiness. Upstairs, I could hear the muffled, frantic whispering of Julian and Claire through the floorboards. They were awake, planning, scheming, trying to figure out how to salvage the wreckage of their relationship with the woman they had spent 5 years trying to erase. The smell of caramelized sugar and fresh brewed espresso drifted down the basement stairs at 6:30 the next morning. It was a stark contrast to the usual morning routine of burnt toast and frantic rushing. When I walked up to the kitchen, I found Claire standing by the stove, wearing an expensive silk robe. The kitchen island was covered with a spread of fresh fruit, pastries from the bakery downtown, and the silver coffee service Richard's mother had given us, which Claire usually kept locked in the dining room hutch. "Eleanor, good morning," Claire said, her voice rising in a cheerful, almost hysterical pitch. She rushed over, attempting to take the small laundry basket I was carrying. "Oh, sweetie, let me get that. You shouldn't be carrying heavy things up those stairs. Sit down, please. I made your favorite, lemon ricotta waffles." I held on to the basket, my grip firm. "I can manage the laundry, Claire, and I usually just have tea." "Well, today is different," she said, her smile stretched so tight her cheeks looked strained. "We want you to be comfortable. Julian, come help your mother." Julian emerged from the hallway dressed in his finest charcoal suit. He looked as though he hadn't slept a wink, but he immediately stepped forward, pulling out the plush, high-backed chair at the head of the breakfast table, the seat he usually reserved for himself. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice thick with a forced, deferential warmth. "Please, sit." I sat, more out of a desire to stop their frantic hovering than to enjoy their hospitality. Lily was already at the table, looking back and forth between her parents and me with a look of profound, 6-year-old confusion. "Mommy," Lily said, pointing her fork at me, "why is Grandma sitting in Daddy's chair? You said her cardigans are too dusty for the nice chairs." Claire's face went entirely white. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh, her eyes darting to me in sheer terror. "Oh, Lily, sweetheart, what a silly thing to say! Grandma's cardigans are lovely. Mommy was just talking about dry cleaning. Yes, go wash your hands, sweetie." "But you said—" "Lily, wash your hands. Now," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. When Lily had scrambled out of the room, Julian sat down next to me, leaning in with an air of desperate intensity. "Mom, about the Route 9 land. I spoke to my managing partner, Mr. Henderson, first thing this morning. He was stunned when I told him my family owned the holding company. He wants to meet with you, personally." "Does he?" I asked, sipping my tea. The water was lukewarm. Claire had been so focused on the waffles, she had forgotten to let the kettle boil properly. "Yes. He said if we can finalize the contract by next Friday, he'll personally guarantee my promotion to senior vice president. It comes with a 30% salary increase, Mom, and an equity stake in the regional office." Julian reached across the table, his hand hovering over mine, desperately seeking contact. "It would change everything for us. We could pay off the bridge loan we took out for the house. We could finally get you a proper suite on the main floor. We could renovate the guest wing." The transaction was so transparent it was almost pathetic. For 5 years, they had ignored my presence, treating me like a shadow that cleaned up after them. Now, they were offering to allow me onto the main floor of their lives, but only if I paid the admission price with a multi-million-dollar land deed. Before I could answer, the front door chimed. Beatrice walked into the kitchen, carrying a large bouquet of hydrangeas, my favorite flower, though I hadn't owned a vase to put them in since they sold my house. "Happy Friday, Mom," Beatrice said, sweeping over to press a dry, perfumed kiss against my cheek. "I was just thinking about you on my way in, and I thought, when was the last time we had a proper girls' day? Let's go to that boutique in the village this afternoon. My treat. You deserve some beautiful new things." I looked at the hydrangeas. Then I looked at Beatrice, whose credit card debt I had quietly monitored through the bank statements that occasionally arrived in our shared mailbox. "I have a lot of sewing to do today, Beatrice," I said quietly. "But thank you for the flowers." "Oh, the sewing can wait," Claire chimed in, leaning over the counter. "I'll handle the laundry today, Eleanor. You just go enjoy yourself with your daughter. You've worked so hard for us. It's time we started taking care of you." They were suffocating me with their sudden, desperate kindness. It was far more exhausting than their neglect. Underneath their smiles, I could feel the cold calculation, the panic of realization, and the quiet, simmering resentment that they were now forced to beg the woman they had spent years looking down upon. After breakfast, I excused myself and went down to my basement room, locking the door behind me. The contrast of the quiet, dim space was a relief. I sat at my small sewing desk, pulled out my private flip phone, and called my estate lawyer, Mr. Sterling. He had been Richard's trusted advisor for 40 years, a man who knew the exact depth of our wealth and the exact depth of my children's foolishness. "Eleanor," Mr. Sterling said, his deep, cultured voice immediately bringing a sense of calm to my chest. "I assume Julian has received the letter." "He did," I said. "They all know now." "And how are they reacting?" "They made me lemon ricotta waffles this morning," I said, a faint, humorless smile touching my lips. "And Beatrice bought me hydrangeas." Mr. Sterling let out a dry, soft chuckle. "Ah, the transactional phase. I suspected as much. Have they asked for the land yet?" "Julian's firm is offering him a promotion if I sell to them. He wants me to meet his managing partner next week." I paused, looking out the tiny basement window at the autumn leaves drifting across the concrete window well. "But I need to know the truth, Arthur. I need to know exactly how deep the water is over their heads." "I took the liberty of running a private financial audit on Julian and Beatrice, as you requested last month," Mr. Sterling said, his tone turning serious. "It's not good, Eleanor. Julian has taken out a second mortgage on the house to fund Claire's lifestyle. He has also quietly depleted Lily's college savings account to pay the interest on his personal credit cards. If he doesn't get this promotion, he will likely face foreclosure within 6 months." I closed my eyes. The weight of his words settled on my chest, cold and heavy. "And Beatrice?" I asked. "She is 3 months behind on her rent, and her credit cards are maxed out. She was planning to ask Julian for a loan this weekend, which, of course, he cannot provide." Mr. Sterling paused. "They are on the verge of complete financial collapse, Eleanor. And they think your trust is the safety net that will save them from their own arrogance." "They don't want a mother, Arthur," I whispered, the finality of the realization cracking my voice just a fraction. "They want a savior." "What do you want to do, Eleanor?" I looked at the leather ledger in my drawer. "Tell Vanguard Development that I am reviewing their $3 million overbid. And tell Julian's boss, Mr. Henderson, that I will meet with him next Tuesday. But tell him the meeting will take place here, in my basement." "The basement?" Julian's voice cracked, the word coming out as a strangled gasp. He stared at me across the kitchen island, his hands gripping the quartz counter so hard his knuckles turned yellow. "Mom, you can't be serious. Charles Henderson is the senior managing partner of the firm. He doesn't do business in a basement. He's used to boardroom suites and private clubs." "Then he is welcome to decline the meeting, Julian," I said, my voice as calm and cool as the autumn air outside. I was wiping down the kitchen table, a chore Claire had frantically tried to stop me from doing, though I had insisted, But if he wants to discuss the Route 9 parcel with Finch Land Holdings, he will meet with me here, in my home. But this isn't your home, Eleanor, Claire blurted out, her composure slipping for a brief, frantic second. She immediately caught herself, her face flushing with embarrassment as she tried to soften her tone. I mean, of course it's your home, sweetie. We love having you here. It's just, the basement is so cozy, but it's a bit private. We have that beautiful formal dining room upstairs. I could make some of those lovely little cucumber sandwiches, and we could put out the good china. No thank you, Claire, I said, draping the damp cloth over the sink. The basement is where I live. It is the space you deemed appropriate for me. If Mr. Henderson wants to see how the trustee of a $22 million estate lives, he should see it in its true state. Claire looked as if she might faint. The subtext of my words was a physical blow. She knew exactly what Mr. Henderson would think when he walked down into that damp, chilly space and saw the mother of his rising star living in a windowless guest room next to the water heater. It would expose their greed, their superficiality, and their neglect to the very high society circle they were desperately trying to climb into. By Monday evening, the panic in the house was palpable. Through the thin floorboards, I heard the vacuum running for 3 hours. Claire descended the stairs carrying a heavy plush Persian rug, a cashmere throw blanket, and an expensive landscape painting she had snatched from the living room wall. I just thought we could spruce things up a bit, Eleanor, she said, her breathing shallow as she tried to lay the rug over my worn, thin carpet. Just to make it feel more designed. You know how these old money men are. They appreciate aesthetics. I stood up and gently but firmly took the rug from her hands. Please leave my room the way it is, Claire. But, Eleanor, I have gotten quite used to the dampness and the bare floor, Claire, I said, looking her directly in the eyes. No need to hide it now. It is exactly how you wanted me to live. Please take your things back upstairs. She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears of pure, frustrated rage. But she couldn't say a word. She couldn't risk angering the woman who held the key to her husband's survival. She gathered her things and practically fled up the stairs. Tuesday afternoon arrived, cold and gray. At precisely 2 o'clock, a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled into the driveway. Julian was already waiting on the front porch, his suit pressed so tightly it looked like armor, though he was sweating through his collar in the 50-degree weather. Claire stood just behind the screen door, her hands wringing a silk handkerchief. I watched from my small basement window as Charles Henderson stepped out of the car. He was a man in his late 60s, elegant, with silver hair and the easy, unbothered posture of someone who had never had to worry about a mortgage in his life. Upstairs, the front door opened. I heard Julian's overeager, nervous greeting, followed by Mr. Henderson's deep, quiet baritone. "Where is she, Julian?" Mr. Henderson asked, cutting through my son's stammering pleasantries. Well, sir, she prefers the lower level," Julian stammered, his voice carrying through the vents. "It's very quiet down there, very private. She insists on working from her personal suite." "I see," Mr. Henderson said. A moment later, the heavy basement door opened, and the sound of polished leather shoes descended the stairs. Julian came first, his face pale and slick with sweat, followed by Charles Henderson. Mr. Henderson stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his sharp gray eyes taking in the small space, the exposed pipes, the hum of the dehumidifier, the single twin bed, and the chipped blue willow teacup sitting on my nightstand. His gaze lingered on the thin, worn cardigan I wore. For a long, agonizing moment, no one spoke. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a steady, rhythmic accusation. Charles, I said, rising from my small armchair. Mr. Henderson's face suddenly softened, a look of profound surprise and immediate recognition washing over his features. Eleanor? Eleanor Vance? Julian gasped, his eyes darting between his boss and me. Sir? You know my mother? Know her? Charles Henderson said, ignoring Julian entirely as he stepped forward, extending both hands to take mine. His grip was warm and filled with genuine respect. My dear, I haven't seen you since Richard's memorial. I had no idea you were the E.V. Finch behind the holding company. When the lawyers said the trustee was local, I never dreamed. He paused, his eyes sweeping the small, damp basement room once more, his brow furrowing in deep, aristocratic distaste. Eleanor, what on earth are you doing down here? Why are you living in a basement? Julian let out a small, terrified squeak. My children felt my old bungalow was too much for me to manage, Charles, I said, my voice gentle, carrying a quiet, devastating simplicity. They graciously offered me this space so I could be useful to them. Charles Henderson's expression hardened into a mask of pure, freezing anger. He turned his gaze slowly to Julian, who looked as if he wanted the concrete floor to open up and swallow him whole. Useful, Mr. Henderson repeated, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. He looked back at me. Eleanor, I must admit, when your son submitted his emergency proposal to our board last week, claiming he could secure the Route 9 land by having the trustee declared mentally incompetent due to age, I was deeply concerned. The room went entirely, shockingly cold. I looked at my son. Julian's mouth was open, his eyes wide with a desperate, wild terror. He had tried to destroy my mind, to steal my land, before he ever knew the incompetent trustee was his own mother. The silence that followed Charles Henderson's words was thick, heavy, and absolute. Julian looked as though he had been drained of every drop of blood. His hands hovered in front of him, twitching slightly, as if he wanted to reach out and pull the words back out of the air. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow hitches. Sir, Julian finally whispered, his voice cracking on the single syllable. Sir, please, it was a standard legal maneuver. My legal team suggested we file the preliminary petition to clear the title blockage. I had no idea the trustee I didn't know it was my mother. You filed a petition claiming an elderly widow was suffering from advanced cognitive decline, Mr. Henderson said, his voice quiet, flat, and dripping with aristocratic disgust. You did this without even verifying her identity, simply to bypass a corporate veto. That is not a standard maneuver, Julian. That is fraud. And to discover that the woman you claimed was incompetent is your own mother, whom you have boarded in your basement next to a water heater while she does your laundry, is a moral failure I will not have associated with my firm. Charles, Julian stammered, stepping forward, his eyes wild with panic. Please, if we don't secure the Route 9 land, the whole division— The Route 9 project is no longer your concern, Julian. Mr. Henderson cut him off, his tone freezing. He turned his back on my son, facing me with a respectful nod. Eleanor, I am deeply sorry for this intrusion. Our firm will formally withdraw the petition by 5 o'clock today. Regarding the land, I will contact Arthur Sterling tomorrow morning to discuss a direct purchase, entirely on your terms. If you choose not to sell, I will completely understand. Thank you, Charles, I said softly. I appreciate your integrity. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, glared at Julian one last time, and walked up the stairs. His heavy, dignified steps echoed through the floorboards, followed by the soft click of the front door. For a long minute, Julian didn't move. He stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. The arrogant, sharp-edged corporate climber was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified boy. "Mom," he whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. "Mom, please. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know it was you." "Would it have been acceptable if it were someone else's mother, Julian?" I asked. My voice carried no anger, no resentment. It was merely a quiet, scientific question. He had no answer. He covered his face with his hands and let out a dry, choked sob. The basement door at the top of the stairs burst open. Claire stood there, her face contorted in a mixture of horror and fury. She had clearly been listening at the door. "You idiot!" she screamed down the stairs, her voice rising to a screech that made Lily cry from the living room. "You absolute idiot, Julian! You tried to have her declared incompetent? Do you have any idea what you've done? He's going to fire you! We're going to lose the house! Everything is gone!" She didn't come down the stairs. Even in her panic, she refused to step into the basement. She simply stood at the threshold, screaming at her husband, her anger born not of disgust for his betrayal of his mother, but of terror that their luxurious facade was about to crumble. "Claire, shut up!" Julian yelled back, his voice cracked and desperate as he finally found his anger. "I did it for us. I did it to save the mortgage, to pay for your country club dues and your organic linen. I did it for you." "Don't you dare blame me," she shrieked. I stood in the center of my small room, watching them tear each other apart. The psychological balance of the household had shattered in an instant. They were no longer the benevolent protectors harboring a poor widow. They were two starving wolves trapped in a cage of their own making, and they were beginning to realize that I held the key. I walked past Julian, stepping slowly up the stairs. When I reached the top, Claire immediately shrank back, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at me with a terror so pure it was almost pitiable. "Eleanor?" she whispered, her hands shaking. I had no idea he was doing that. I swear I would never have let him." "I'm going to take Lily to the park, Claire," I said, my voice calm, ignoring her lies completely. "She shouldn't be in the house while you and Julian are sorting through your finances." I didn't wait for her permission. I walked into the living room where Lily was sitting on the sofa, clutching her tablet and crying softly. I knelt in front of her, wiping her tears with my thumb. "Come, sweetheart," I said gently. "Let's go get some ice cream." Lily immediately threw her small arms around my neck. "Can we, Grandma? Can we go away from the shouting?" "Yes, baby," I whispered, holding her close. "We can go away from the shouting." We spent the afternoon at the park. I watched Lily run through the amber leaves, her laughter light and innocent. I bought her a double scoop of strawberry ice cream, sitting on a green wooden bench under the autumn sun. For a few hours, I pretended I was just a normal grandmother, living a normal, quiet life. But when we returned to the house at 5, the silence was suffocating. The lights were dim. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island in the dark, an empty bottle of whiskey beside him. Claire was locked in her bedroom upstairs. Beatrice was sitting on the living room sofa, her head in her hands, having arrived to find her brother's life in ruins. They all looked up when I walked in. They looked at me with a desperate, heavy dependency that made the air feel thick. They knew that with one phone call, I could end Julian's career, foreclose on their home, and leave them with nothing. I patted Lily's head and sent her upstairs to wash her hands. Then, I walked down to the basement, closing the door behind me. I sat in my armchair, the grandfather clock ticking in the dark. I pulled out my private phone and dialed Mr. Sterling. "Arthur," I said when he answered, "I need you to contact Julian's mortgage lender tomorrow morning. I want to buy the note on their house, every penny of their debt. I want Finch Land Holdings to become their sole creditor." There was a short pause on the line, followed by the rustle of papers. "And Beatrice's building, Eleanor? The owner has been looking to liquidize." "Buy that too," I said, my voice steady, carrying the cold, quiet weight of a mother who had finally decided to take back her world. "Let them keep their beautiful lifestyle for now. Let them believe they are safe. But write the contracts so that I own the ground beneath their feet. I want to see how they behave when they realize they are living on my mercy." At 9:15 on Wednesday morning, Julian was still sitting at the kitchen island in his pajamas. His charcoal suit jacket, usually brushed and hung with care, was draped over the back of a bar stool, one of the sleeves crumpled against the quartz. He hadn't shaved. He sat staring into a cold cup of black coffee, his phone face down on the counter. The firm had placed him on indefinite administrative leave, pending an internal review of his ethical conduct. Claire was hovering by the toaster, her movements frantic and disjointed. Every time the floorboards creaked, she flinched. When I walked into the kitchen to wash Lily's breakfast plate, Claire immediately dropped her butter knife and rushed to take it from me. "I'll do that, Eleanor. Please, go sit down," she said, her voice trembling with a desperate, high-pitched eagerness. "You've done so much. Julian, tell your mother to sit down." Julian didn't look up. He merely gave a weak, dismissive wave of his hand. "Sit down, Mom." I didn't sit. I kept my hand on the porcelain plate, feeling the smooth, cold weight of it. "I am perfectly capable of washing a plate, Claire. It is my routine." Of course," Claire stammered, backing away, her hands wringing the edge of her silk robe. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of terror and hope, as if she were trying to read her future in the wrinkles of my face. We want to make sure you know how valued you are. We've been so blind, Eleanor. Truly. We're so sorry for how crowded things have felt." It was a masterclass in manipulative politeness. They were trying to build a bridge of hollow words over 5 years of silent abuse, hoping I would cross it and hand them my husband's fortune. Beatrice arrived 20 minutes later. She didn't sweep into the room with her usual theatrical complaints. She walked in quietly, her face pale, her designer tote bag clutched tightly against her chest. She sat down next to Julian, looking at me with wide, anxious eyes. "Mom," Beatrice said, her voice small, stripped of its usual self-absorbed confidence. "We need to talk about what's happening. Julian's firm, they're going to ruin him. If Charles Henderson pulls his promotion, they'll foreclose on this house by the end of the year." "I am aware of Julian's financial situation, Beatrice," I said, leaning against the counter. Claire stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Eleanor, if you sign the Route 9 deed over to Julian's firm, Mr. Henderson will reinstate him. He told Julian's managing partner that the land is the only thing that matters. It's for Lily, Eleanor. If we lose this house, where will Lily go? She'll have to change schools. We'll be ruined. Surely Richard wouldn't have wanted his granddaughter to suffer for our mistakes." They were using Lily as a human shield. It was the oldest trick in the parental handbook, and they played it without a shred of shame. They wanted me to believe that my silence was the weapon hurting my granddaughter, rather than their own decades of reckless spending and arrogance. I looked at Julian. "Is that what you want, Julian? You want me to use your father's legacy to pay for your second mortgage? Julian finally raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, and filled with a desperate, burning resentment. It's not just a mortgage, Mom. It's my life. If I lose this, I have nothing. I'm 34. I can't start over. You have millions sitting in a bank account and you're watching us drown. Why? Just to teach us a lesson? Just because we didn't buy you enough expensive gifts? The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of his words didn't shock me. It was the natural conclusion of the monster we had created by shielding him from reality for too long. Your father and I didn't want gifts, Julian, I said softly. We wanted a son who didn't try to declare his mother mentally incompetent to steal her property. Julian flinched, his mouth closing with a sharp click. Beside him, Beatrice looked down at the counter, unable to meet my eye. Before anyone could speak, Beatrice's phone began to ring. The shrill, cheerful chime broke the suffocating tension in the room. She looked at the screen, her brow furrowing, and answered it. Hello? Yes, this is Beatrice Finch. She listened for a moment, her face gradually losing what little color it had left. What? No, that's impossible. My lease isn't up for another 6 months. I've been working on a payment plan with the leasing office. She paused, her eyes darting to me, then back to the floor. Her breathing became rapid, panicked. A 5-day cure or quit notice? But the building was just sold. How can the new owner do this? I need to speak to the manager. There was another brief pause before the caller apparently hung up. Beatrice slowly lowered the phone, her hand shaking so violently she dropped it onto the counter. They're evicting me, she whispered, her voice rising in a pitch of pure terror. The new holding company that bought my building, they're terminating all delinquent leases immediately. I have 5 days to pay $15,000 in back rent and fees, or they'll lock me out. I don't have $15,000. I don't even have $1,500. She turned to me, her eyes wide, begging. Mom, please. You have the trust. You could write a check for $15,000 and it wouldn't even register on your accounts. Please, Mom, don't let them throw me onto the street. I looked at my daughter, who had spent the last 5 years dropping her dirty laundry at my feet and demanding I fix her life, without once asking if I had enough money for my own groceries. I will contact the holding company's representatives, Beatrice, I said, my voice calm, carrying no promise of relief. I will see what can be done. Thank you, Mom. Oh, thank you, she sobbed, reaching out to hug me, but I stepped back, adjusting my cardigan, avoiding her touch. My private phone vibrated in my pocket. I knew what it was. It was a text from Mr. Sterling, confirming that the purchase of Beatrice's delinquent lease and Julian's primary mortgage note was complete. Finch Land Holdings now owned their debts, their homes, and their futures. I looked at my family, my broken, desperate family, huddled together in their expensive, fragile kitchen, entirely unaware that the tyrannical corporate entity squeezing the air out of their lungs was the very woman standing before them, washing a 6-year-old's breakfast plate. I am going to do the laundry now, I said, picking up the basket. Please make sure Lily's shoes are put away in the closet. Someone might trip. The dining room table had been set with a precision that bordered on the grotesque. Claire had spent the afternoon polishing the silver, her movements frantic and silent. For dinner, she had ordered a premium roast from the butcher downtown, plating it on the fine china we usually reserved for holidays. When I walked up the basement stairs at 6, she immediately pulled out the chair at the head of the table, hovering over it like a courtier. Sit here, Eleanor, she said, her voice carrying a fragile, breathless cheerfulness. We want you to be at the center of the table tonight. Julian, pour your mother some wine.
Julian rose quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he poured the deep red liquid into a crystal glass. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt and pale under the dining room's chandelier. Beatrice sat opposite him, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her phone sitting face down on the linen cloth like a dormant threat. They served me first. They carved the roast, passed the vegetables, and watched my every movement with a terrifying, hungry intensity.
It was the transactional phase of their desperation, laid bare under the warm dining room lights. They believed that if they treated me like a queen for an hour, I would write the checks that would save them from the wreckage of their own lives. "Mom," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, confidential register as he leaned across the table. "I was thinking, once we get this land situation sorted with Charles Henderson, we should really look into renovating the main floor. We could easily build a beautiful, sunny suite for you right off the garden. You wouldn't have to deal with those steep basement stairs anymore." "The basement stairs are fine, Julian," I said, cutting a small piece of beef. "I have gotten used to them." "But you shouldn't have to," Claire chimed in, her hands wringing her cloth napkin under the table. "You deserve the best, Eleanor. We've been so selfish, taking your help for granted. We want to make it up to you. We could even go on a family vacation this winter, just the 5 of us and Lily. To Hawaii, perhaps?" The cost of their love was so easily calculated. A $15,000 check for Beatrice's back rent and a land deed to save Julian's career. If I paid that price, I would be rewarded with a sunny room on the main floor and a trip to Hawaii. If I didn't, I would remain in the damp basement, invisible and ignored. "I don't care much for the beach, Claire," I said softly. The table fell into a tense, awkward silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, its slow, heavy rhythm filling the gaps between their desperate thoughts. They were realizing that the old, compliant Eleanor, the mother who had quietly absorbed their slights and washed their dishes for 5 years, was gone. After dinner, I returned to my room in the basement. The quiet of the lower level was a relief after the suffocating hypocrisy of the dining room. I sat in my armchair, turning on the small sewing lamp, and picked up a pair of Lily's socks that needed darning. A sharp knock on the basement door broke the silence. "Come in," I said. Julian walked down the stairs. He wasn't carrying a plate of food or a glass of wine. He held a thick, certified letter from his mortgage lender, the paper crumpled where his grip had been too tight. His face was entirely bloodless. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped into the dim light. "The bank. They just sent this. I don't understand what's happening." "What is it, Julian?" I asked, not looking up from my darning. "The mortgage on the house. They've transferred the note to a private investment trust, and the trust is auditing our account." He took a step closer, holding the paper out to me as if it were a bomb. "They're calling in the bridge loan we took out last year. They say we have 48 hours to provide asset verification, or they'll accelerate the foreclosure process. We don't have the assets, Mom. If they accelerate the loan, the bank will seize the house by the end of the month." He collapsed onto the small wooden stool near my selling desk, putting his head in his hands. "They're going to take my home, Mom. Lily's home. Unless—" He looked up at me, his eyes wide and desperate, shining with tears of pure panic. "They said if we can provide a cosigner with substantial liquid assets, they'll halt the audit and reinstate the original terms. I have the paperwork here." He pulled a document from the envelope and laid it on my sewing desk, right next to Lily's socks. He slid a heavy gold pen toward my hand. "The trust is called Finch Land Holdings," Julian said, entirely unaware of the irony. "The same trust that owns the Route 9 land. If you sign this as the trustee, Mom, your signature on the cosigner line will stop the foreclosure instantly. It's just a formality. They won't actually touch your money. It's just to prove we have backing. I looked at the document. It was a standard corporate guarantee, drafted by Mr. Sterling's office under my direct instruction. If I signed it, I would be legally tying my fortune to Julian's debt, shielding him from the consequences of his arrogance. If I didn't, the trap I had quietly bought from the bank would snap shut on his life. Julian watched me, his breath hitching in his chest. He was waiting for the maternal instinct to override my silence. He was waiting for his mother to do what she had always done, sacrifice herself to keep him safe. I picked up the gold pen. The metal was heavy, cold, and polished. I looked at my son, tracing the sharp, selfish lines of his face, seeing the boy who had tried to have me declared incompetent just 7 days ago. I set the pen down on the desk, placing it precisely parallel to the edge of the paper. "No, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of anger. "I won't sign it." "What do you mean, no?" Julian's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a sharp, vibrating edge of panic that seemed to shake the very air in my small room. He stared at the gold pen resting on the sewing desk as if it had suddenly turned into a scorpion. "I won't sign the guarantee, Julian," I said, my voice quiet and steady as I continued to darn Lily's sock. The yellow thread was bright against the gray wool. "Mom, you don't understand," he stammered, rising from the stool, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "If you don't sign this, they foreclose. It's not a threat. It's a legal certainty. They'll take the house. Do you want us on the street? Do you want your granddaughter sleeping in a shelter?" "You took out a second mortgage to pay for Claire's country club dues, Julian," I said, looking up at him. "And when that wasn't enough, you quietly emptied your daughter's college savings account to cover the interest on your personal credit cards. You made those choices. Not me." Julian froze. His face went from pale to a sickly ash gray. He took a half step back, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process how his poor, simple mother had uncovered his deepest, most shameful secrets. How do you know about Lily's account?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the basement door at the top of the stairs slammed open. Claire and Beatrice came rushing down, their faces pale and distorted with anxiety. They had been waiting in the hallway, listening to every word through the thin door. "Eleanor, please!" Claire cried, throwing herself into my room. She didn't hesitate to step onto the bare concrete floor this time. She fell to her knees beside my armchair, her hands reaching out to grab my knees, her polished nails digging into the fabric of my trousers. "You can't do this. He's your son, your only son. How can you be so cold? You have millions sitting in a trust, and you're going to let them throw us onto the street?" "Mom, please," Beatrice sobbed, leaning against the damp concrete wall. "If you don't help Julian, he can't help me. I'll be evicted on Friday. I have nowhere to go. My friends, my career, everything will be ruined. Why are you doing this to us? What did we do that was so terrible?" I looked at the three of them, crowded into my tiny basement room. The space was suffocatingly small, smelling of damp concrete and Claire's expensive perfume. For 5 years, they had ignored this room, treating it like a closet where they stored their inconvenient relative. Now, they were all on their knees in my territory, begging for the very air they breathed. The psychological power shift was absolute, but it brought me no satisfaction. It was merely a devastating confirmation of what Richard and I had feared. Their love was entirely conditional, a commodity they only offered when they needed to purchase their survival. "You ask what you did, Beatrice," I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet, heavy authority that made them all go dead silent. "For 5 years, You dropped your dirty laundry at my feet and never once asked how my joints were feeling. For 5 years, Claire instructed me to stay in the basement so her wealthy friends wouldn't have to look at me. And Julian? Julian tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my land. "Mom, I told you, that was a mistake!" Julian cried, his voice cracking as he fell to his knees beside his wife. "I was desperate. I was trying to save us." "You were trying to save your lifestyle, Julian," I said, setting Lily's sock down on the desk. "There is a difference." I stood up slowly. They looked up at me from the floor, their faces wet with tears, their eyes wide with a desperate, heavy dependency. They looked like children, but they were adults who had spent decades learning how to exploit the people who loved them. "This is my room," I said quietly. "Please leave." "Eleanor, please," Claire begged, her voice rising in a screech. "Leave," I repeated, my tone carrying a cold, absolute finality. They slowly rose from the floor, their movements heavy and defeated. Julian picked up the unsigned guarantee, his hands shaking so much he crumpled the paper. They shuffled out of my room and up the stairs, their quiet, desperate whispers fading into the upper levels of the house. I sat back down in my chair, the silence of the basement returning like a heavy blanket. I pulled out my private phone and dialed Mr. Sterling. My hand was steady, but my chest felt hollow, as if the last of my maternal warmth had been carved out of me. "Arthur?" I said when he answered. "The 48-hour audit deadline for Julian's mortgage expires tomorrow at noon. Let the bank proceed with the foreclosure paperwork. Do not halt it." "And Beatrice's lease, Eleanor?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice professional and quiet. "The 5-day notice expires on Friday. Notify the property manager that Finch Land Holdings will not accept any late payments or payment plans from Beatrice Finch," I said. "Let the eviction proceed." "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" Arthur asked, a rare note of hesitation in his voice. "Once the gears start turning, it will be very difficult to stop them. They will lose everything." "I am sure, Arthur," I said, looking at the grandfather clock in the corner. "They need to feel the cold of the winter before they can appreciate the warmth of the house. Let the winter come." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, watching the slow, rhythmic swing of the clock's brass pendulum. The storm was finally here, and I was the one who had opened the door. By Friday morning, the silence in the house was no longer tense. It was dead. The moving truck stood in the driveway, its metal ramp clattering against the asphalt like a guillotine. Upstairs, Claire was packing the last of Lily's toys into cardboard boxes, her quiet, rhythmic sobbing echoing down the stairs. Julian sat on the bottom step of the staircase, his head in his hands, surrounded by suitcases. They had lost. The foreclosure was final. Beatrice's loft had been cleared out the day before, and she now sat on one of Julian's suitcases, her eyes swollen, staring blankly at the bare walls of the home they could no longer afford. When I walked into the hallway carrying my small sewing basket, Julian looked up. His eyes were hollow, filled with a deep, burning resentment that he no longer had the energy to hide. "I hope you're happy, Mom," he whispered, his voice dry and cracked. "You got what you wanted. We're ruined. The banks took everything. We have nowhere to go. I hope your $20 million keeps you warm at night because you don't have a family anymore." "You have a family, Julian," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You just don't have a mansion." "Don't patronize him, Eleanor." Claire screamed from the top of the stairs, her face red and distorted as she ran down to stand beside her husband. You watched us drown. You had the power to save us with a single signature, and you chose to destroy us. We are going to a cheap, run-down motel because of you. I hope you're proud of yourself. I didn't answer them. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out a set of brass keys, and laid them on the bottom step next to Julian's polished leather shoes. These are the keys to a duplex on Elm Street, I said quietly. It has 3 bedrooms, a small garden, and a quiet yard for Lily. The electricity and water are turned on. You can move your things there today. Julian stared at the keys, his brow furrowing in deep, suspicious confusion. What is this? Who rented this for us? Finch Land Holdings, I said. The trust bought the property last week. So what? Julian sneered, his voice dripping with bitter irony. You're our landlord now? You bought a cheap rental just to keep us under your thumb? To watch us live in poverty while you decide when to throw us out? Go to the house, Julian, I said softly, adjusting the collar of my faded cardigan. The paperwork is on the kitchen counter. Read it before you judge the space. I didn't wait for them to pack. I took Lily's hand, walked out of the house, and let them follow in their rental truck. The duplex on Elm Street was modest, built of warm red brick, surrounded by tall oak trees that dropped golden leaves onto the small front porch. It was clean, simple, and entirely ordinary. It was the kind of home Richard and I had started our lives in decades ago, before the wealth had grown too heavy for our children to carry. When Julian, Claire, and Beatrice walked through the front door, they were braced for horror. Instead, they found a sunlit living room, freshly painted walls, and the familiar tick of my old grandfather clock, which Mr. Sterling's movers had already placed in the hallway. On the wooden kitchen counter lay a thick blue folder from Vance and Associates. Julian approached it slowly, as if it were a trap. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the legal documents inside. Claire and Beatrice crowded over his shoulder, their breathing shallow. As Julian read, the color gradually returned to his face, replaced by a shock so profound he had to grip the edge of the counter to keep his balance. "What is it, Julian?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling. "What does it say?" She bought my mortgage," Julian whispered, his voice cracking as tears began to spill over his eyelids. "She didn't let the bank foreclose. Finch Land Holdings bought the entire note from the lender. And then, she sold our old house to a private buyer." "She sold it?" Claire gasped. "But then, we're homeless." "No, Claire," Julian said, his hands shaking as he turned the page. "The sale of the mansion paid off the primary mortgage, the second mortgage, and your country club debts. It paid off Beatrice's $15,000 in back rent and cleared her credit cards." He looked up at me, his eyes wide, shining with a mixture of disbelief, shame, and a sudden, overwhelming realization of what I had actually done. "The remaining equity from the sale," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a trembling whisper, "has been locked into a private, irrevocable trust. For Lily. It will pay for her school, her college, and her future. Neither Claire, nor Beatrice, nor I can touch a single penny of it." He looked down at the paper again, his voice barely audible. "We can live in this duplex rent-free, Mom. But the trust will only cover the property taxes. If we want utilities, food, and clothes, we have to work for them. The trust will audit our bank accounts every 6 months to ensure we are living within our means." The room went entirely, beautifully quiet. Beatrice fell into one of the kitchen chairs, covering her face as she let out a long, shuddering sob, not of grief, but of absolute relief. Claire stood frozen, looking at the clean, simple kitchen, realizing that the crushing mountain of debt they had been hiding under for years had suddenly been wiped clean. I had not destroyed them. I had cured them. I had stripped them of their hollow luxury, their toxic status, and their desperate pretense of wealth, and I had brought them down to the earth, where they could finally stand on their own 2 feet. I had saved them from their own ruin, but I had done it on my terms, ensuring they would never again be able to treat my love or my husband's legacy as a transaction. Julian slowly walked across the kitchen floor. He stopped in front of me, his shoulders shaking as he looked at my faded cardigan, my wrinkled hands, and the quiet strength I had carried in his basement for 5 long years. Without a word, he fell to his knees. He didn't grab my clothes, and he didn't beg. He simply leaned his forehead against my knee and let out a quiet, broken sob. This time, his tears were real. Claire stepped forward, her face wet with tears, and gently placed her hand over Julian's shoulder, looking at me with a soft, genuine nod of gratitude. Beatrice rose from her chair, walking over to join them, her posture finally free of the arrogance she had worn like armor. I reached down, my hands steady and warm, and gently patted my son's head. Outside, the golden autumn sun was beginning to set, casting long, warm shadows through the kitchen window. Lily ran out into the backyard, her laughter drifting back into the house as she chased a squirrel through the fallen leaves. We had finally stopped pretending to be rich. And in the quiet of our new, ordinary life, they were finally learning how to be a family.